Nier's perception, and by extension Yoko Taro's, has been interesting to watch. If you've taken an interest in the man's back catalog of work, whether it was playing them yourself or from secondhand sources, you probably know he's been getting the equivalent of shoestring budgets for most of his career. But despite the limitations placed on him, those works often leave a big impression on people. While we don't know the exact budgets afforded to the series, prior to the remake of Replicant, Nier Automata was the first Yoko Taro project that really felt given the support it deserved from Square. No doubt the cult status he once had being a factor in this. However, I say once had for a reason. Nowadays, Taro's name is brought up in the same capacity as Nomura, Kamiya, Itsuno, and many other well-known game directors. For a fan, that is something exciting. Sure, when something is niche and unknown, it's kinda cool, right? Not many people are into it. It's like this special secret thing. But at the same time, when something's niche, you're always trying to get people to experience this thing you love. You want other people to see how incredible it is. Which brings me to Nier. It and Drakengard 3 were really the turning point, the cusp of the transition into mainstream popularity. Automata got not only the budget, but the attention the series deserved, even if that inevitably comes with the negative side effects as well. That being said though, as you might assume, the original Nier being at that turning point still left the game feeling constrained by those previous limits that the series never seemed to be able to break from. In spite of this though, I would say it had many elements done better than even its successor, leading to a somewhat bittersweet feeling over time. Again, it's exciting that Automata got its spotlight, but it was still a shame that what I believed to be Taro's strongest work would continue going overlooked in its little sister's shadow. As such, I've been holding out hope for a remake since the day I put down the controller with Automata, and having it finally come to fruition, as good as it did, really has left me wanting to discuss why this game in particular still has me feeling so strongly a decade later. My goal with this video isn't to be a review of Nier Replicant. It's not going to be a deep dive into the lore or anything of the sort. It's simply going to be why I believe this game, all of the parts that make up the experience that is Nier Replicant, is not just Taro's strongest, but one of, if not, the best in the medium. I'd like to start off with what I consider one of the greatest strengths of Nier, the way it handles the protagonist. There are of course two ways to approach making one. Firstly, you have your established character, and this is generally what I prefer. This allows a protagonist to be fleshed out, have established goals, and form relationships that feel real. As a result, I believe it leads to much greater emotional highs and far more interesting stories. Essentially, you're only interacting with a narrative someone created. The other route is that of the self-insert, blank slate characters. A lot of role-playing games do this, stuff like Skyrim or the more recent Persona games, to name some popular examples. The issue is in contrast because you're self-inserting. A lot of the relationships feel unearned. Your character can't, in-game, respond to things other than the most generic acknowledgement. While some will give you choices for roleplay purposes, whether they be happy, angry, sad, etc., the reality is the reaction often feels hollow, beyond what you mentally project onto them. They very rarely affect the course of the game, until it comes down to a final decision, or maybe your choices alter a cutscene or two. In saying that though, there are benefits obviously. Because that character is a medium for you, that can elevate some sort of connection on its own, and generally because you're picking responses, or the reactions aren't too strong, there's less of a chance the character will have a completely polar reaction to the one you, the player, have. In these cases, you're taking a much more active role in writing the narrative, especially so if you are in fact projecting your own thoughts onto these interactions. Nier for its protagonist sets out to do both, which sounds like it would be an awful proposition. These two methods are opposed in a lot of ways. However, think about it. If you could create a bind between the two, if you could have the personal connections of the self-insert, but the emotional highs in the narrative of the pre-established, well, conceptually, you could really pull someone in, and I've seen several games use this approach, but Nier by far, in my experience, has done it the best. It's something that starts as soon as the player's name is chosen. Now, a lot of games give you this customization. Most obviously would be those with self-inserts such as Robin from Fire Emblem Awakening. Then there's cases similar to Nier, where a character is still defined, but you name them, such as Final Fantasy VII with Cloud. You'll notice, though, that I was able to give these characters names we all agree on, despite that customization. And that's because in both instances, it's commonly accepted to give a character a canon name. That's not the case here, though. The protagonist does not have one. In fact, Yoko Taro is adamant about that. The vast majority of supplementary material follows suit with this mentality. There are exceptions, like some of the novellas or the Japanese drama CD, but there's a reason these are the exceptions, Taro stating as such. When I was writing the novellas, I was told I had to give him a name, so I begrudgingly used that name. But as far as the game goes, he's simply the protagonist. Nier isn't his name. Some will call him Nier just as these exceptions do, for simplicity's sake. But I've always seen these comments that there is no name, that Taro never willingly goes that route, as acknowledgement that to some degree it's important. And from my perspective, it's a large aspect of what makes certain scenes hit far harder. It may be simple, but referring to someone by name naturally establishes a more intimate connection, and that's one of the benefits of the blank slate. This is taken advantage of heavily in the closing hours of each route for this game. One of the first examples that always springs to my mind being a meal sacrifice. While it's already an emotional scene, losing this friend that you spent so much time with throughout your journey, essentially giving his life to protect you, and allow you to see your goal through. It really just feels like the final push of driving that knife through your heart, when you see him calling out to you in his last moments.
I want to see you again. I want to see all of you again. Just one more time.
And on the positive side, there was when I finally got to reading Kaine's weapon story. At several points in the game, Kaine refers to herself as his sword, or speaks of him.
I'm a curse. A freak. I know that. But guess what? He still accepts me. He still forgives me.
Oh, come on. You're doing this for him?
I'm tired of this world, and everybody in it. But I'll become his sword one last time.
And while yes, it's more than obvious that these lines are referring to you, having it stated even more explicitly so, in the weapon entry, seeing your name in what very much is a confession from her, is just really the cherry on top for those closing hours. Then of course, there's nothing in my opinion that executes this better than Yona's existence. We'll be taking a look at more of these examples later, but from my viewpoint, the height of it takes place at the end of your first playthrough, where you're asked to recall all of Yona's favorite things. The first few are recalled automatically.
What's my favorite food? Cookies. What's my favorite book? That's my magic storybook. What's my favorite place? Home with you. What's my favorite flower? The lunar tear, of course. Okay, one more question. Who do I love more than anyone?
Simply knowing I had to type my own name here, I was getting all teary-eyed in front of, well, a lot of people. What a good fucking game. Maybe that sounds absurd, that I would get emotional over such little things. Possibly you're thinking how you've experienced similar inclusions in other games. And, with very few exceptions, they never really work for me. Plenty of blank slate games have your name interwoven into the narrative, and try to take advantage of those personal elements afforded by this type of protagonist. But in my experience, there's not enough there emotionally to pull an actual moment off like this. It's really not the fact that my name is just written there. The reason these tiny inclusions can become something so much more is because of what they're built off, the relationships in the game. Much like those moments, I believe Nier is highly effective in getting your feelings where the game wants them to be, instead of telling you how to feel, which a lot of media tends to fall into. Let's take Popola and Devila for example. These characters clearly have a motherly relationship with the protagonist. That's the intention. As the player, this can be felt early on, from them giving you extra money when sending you on errands, helping take care of Yona, and other various little interactions that occur throughout the story. Particularly, the moment that always sticks out to me is once when I was going to the tavern to ask something of Devila, and in the middle of the conversation, she asked me if I wanted a drink. Then when I responded I'm too young, commenting on her drinking habits, she laughed it off like, "Oh yeah, you'll understand when you're older." And the conversation went back on topic. Perhaps this interaction is very simple as well, but the execution and writing of the situation just was eerily similar to ones I found myself in at family parties when I was a child. There's a lot of that, where it just feels relatable, so it hurts all the more when, from your own perspective, they betray you. When the protagonist is caught in disbelief, when he says,
Please, don't do this, Popola! You and Devila were like parents to me!
I think on some level, you feel that just as the character does. However, as previously alluded to, the most impressive example of this when it comes to the characters is once again, Yona. Sure, she doesn't seem to make as big of an impression as fan favorites such as Kaine, Emile, or Vice, but I think she is by far the easiest to get wrong, and that's what makes her execution remarkable. So many games plant you with a character you have to care about, and you're just expected to. Maybe it's your kid, the character's spouse, you name it. The point being, the game tells you care about this person and doesn't really flesh out why you should beyond this connection. They're your family, of course you want to save them. That is still her role here. You're constantly taking care of this girl, running those errands, reprimanding her for not listening at times even. But throughout it, you're reminded of why you're doing all that. From the conversations you have with her directly, to every step of the journey, you see her diary, talking about how much she loves you, how highly she thinks of you, how she wants to get better for you, how her brother is the most amazing person in the world. This character trope can very easily feel like a burden, but she doesn't. Throughout my days playing Nier, I never once cared how much time it took, running to the various towns in the game, collecting ingredients, spending all my hard-earned money, just so Yona could make me a stew that is probably going to send me into a near-death experience that night. I just wanted her to be happy. Yona could never be a burden.
This smells hideous. She boiled it so long it's like one big pot of slurry.
Eat up, okay?
Sure, Yona. It looks, great. Come tomorrow, Yona's not gonna be the only one here who's sick.
That's exactly how the game wants you to feel, because that's the kind of brother the protagonist is. The game builds these narratives, connections, relationships, naturally, both in typical storytelling fashion and through gameplay. Everything in order to get you to the same emotional state as the protagonist when interacting with these characters. Those personal touches with your name or the small choices given through the journey, they're important. I took a jab earlier at how games often don't have choices that matter until the final section in the game. And it's not that the choices in Nier are dissimilar. What you decide the vast majority of the time will not affect the rest of the game. But while streaming my playthrough of Nier, live on my second channel, Dimitri Monroe Streams, I often describe those choices as the game forcing you to pull the trigger, emphasizing how important those moments felt. Sure, they wouldn't affect the world at large, but they largely affected the world for these characters. And the consequences of these interactions feel as if they fall on your hands, in the same way a role-playing game is trying to achieve. The best way I can describe the severity I felt in those moments is until I wrote this video, I didn't know the dialogue for some of these choices, because I would never lie to the lighthouse lady, to Gideon, to the bagman's wife. Any choice the game gave me, every playthrough, I would answer the same. While delivering the truth in some of these circumstances feels hard, and I am someone who likes seeing all the optional content when given a choice, as there can be interesting revelations there. I sometimes reset games even, just to see that. But I couldn't bring myself to in Nier, because of how strongly I feel about the characters, and answering the way true to my feelings. Sometimes it's not even really a choice. In these situations, you're given the exact same answer for both options. And it's not like the cases I see all too often with games, where both choices are the same in different words, simply for the illusion of choice. But there is no illusion here. The reasoning is to emphasize there could only be one answer. I like that, because these are crucial moments all the same. Just clicking the button, pulling the trigger, helps it feel like you were the one who initiated.
We're here to rescue Yona.
In contrast though, I think that dichotomy helps alleviate the issue of disconnect that can arise, as I briefly mentioned earlier when speaking of the compromises that come with making a character the player. The developer can't give the character much in the way of development, interaction, or even reaction, because it can't be at odds with the actual player. I've explained how the game does its best to not create this scenario to begin with, but even if there's a chance you don't entirely agree with the actions taken. The fact that the brother still feels like his own existence, with the lore completely separate from whoever's holding the controller, I think that makes it not feel so at odds with oneself if that situation occurs, and your reaction isn't perfectly to his. For me, this only happened once in the game, the section where your town is fearful of both Emil and Kaine, so they're forced to sleep outside. Immediately I'm thinking to myself, my house is so far away from town, why can't I just have them stay in there? And when the protagonist later on tries approaching the idea of them not separating, his thought is for him to sleep outside as well instead of going to the house. The game forcing this decision would be a lot more bothersome to me if this character was a typical self-insert, and there was no disconnect between us, but there is. So it's easier to let slide by, as well as giving us some good scenes between Emil and Kaine, lessening the blow. However, for the rest of the game, I always felt relatively on page with the protagonist. The fact that the only moment of disconnect I even have to pull from is the result of me being frustrated just as him is proof of that. I simply saw more options. Nier comes at you from both possible angles. It doesn't solely give you a character you can come to sympathize with, but its story mechanically works these connections into the player as well, making you understand those emotions all the same. Now, I want to continue talking about the protagonist, but more so with his creation and existence outside of the games, not necessarily how the meta of his design works. One thing you probably know about Nier is there were originally two versions produced in Japan, one of Replicant and one of Gestalt. However, for this release we've only gotten Replicant, which I believe this was both the correct decision to make and strictly a benefit for the game. Originally over here, it was the opposite. In the West, we only got Gestalt, which plays into a major factor of its existence. The main difference between these two was the protagonist's physicality. In Replicant, we're given a young boy, and with Gestalt, an older man, both tasked with taking care of their younger sister or daughter respectfully. It wasn't believed that having that pretty boy young protagonist would sell well outside Japan, so gritty old man it was. I've seen a lot of people online incorrectly attribute this decision to the Japanese studio themselves, and while they certainly get the final say, that claim isn't actually true. Included in the bonus features of the Nier Orchestra Concert 12018 Blu-ray are comments from Saito Yusuke, recalling that they received a request from overseas to add the character design we know from Gestalt. The fact that so many seem annoyed or clamored for Gestalt version of this re-release to this day, as well as many modding the game to make it as such, can show you that reasoning probably had weight to it, especially years ago. For me though, I've always wanted Replicant. I very much enjoyed Gestalt. On its own, it's still an excellent game, but it felt off, like something wasn't quite right, almost as if something was missing. And after playing the re-release of Replicant, I can for sure tell you, those thoughts were not misplaced. Firstly though, even removed from this game, let's establish that I'm worn out on the father-child setup Gestalt goes for. The West seemingly has an obsession with it when it comes to media, particularly in the end-of-the-world settings like this. Again, probably why it was chosen. Don't get me wrong, that type of setup can work really well, but the idea of having a brother-sister relationship be the core of this game is so much more intriguing to me. Not just because it's far less used, but it feels increasingly more dire. The idea that these two siblings only have each other. It's not a grown, capable man trying to take care of his child. It's two kids struggling against the world. I think so many scenes are elevated knowing the situation is like this.
This is so unfair. Yona hasn't done anything. Why do terrible things keep happening to us?
One of my favorite examples that displays this is actually one of the very first things you see. While it isn't exactly our Yona, or our protagonist, it shows off the dynamic they have very well. And it's even expanded on much later in the game, when you're given a scene that mirrors the opening, after completing Route B. Yona, finding a cookie, wants to split it with her brother. However, at first he refuses, wanting to make sure she doesn't go hungry. A grown man sacrificing for his child is on some level normal. But here we are dealing with someone who is also a growing child. He needs this just as much as her, yet he's willing to give it up for the sole purpose of making sure she's that much more taken care of. Clearly, this boy shouldn't be in the parental role, but this is only the tip of it. It's an aspect that only becomes more evident as you engage heavier with Nier and its supplementary material. For example, in Sin No Alice, a gacha game Taro helped work on, during the Nier crossover event, the brother's description read as this. For the boy, the existence of his sister was literally everything. He thought that it didn't matter how severe the work was, as long as he could earn enough money for her medicine, whether it was exterminating shades or selling his body. That last line has since been changed to no matter how scarred his mind and body might become, at the request of Square. But the original text was in reference to Replicant Recollection, where the brother, desperate for money to take care of Yona, accepts an offer to sell himself to a man in Seafront. One of the many examples of the town's Greece influence, actually.
Hey, what's the rush? You've got a cute face.
Anyway, I think that in particular states how far this character will go. The grown pop-up protagonist would probably not be in this situation. He would very likely not have anywhere near the struggle that this kid does at literally anything. Yet still, the brother does these things, as long as he'll be able to take care of his sister. This dynamic is so much stronger and so much sadder. That's why I like it.
We need help. Please, somebody, we need help! Help us!
But it's not just Yona. Every relationship in this game seems so much more suited for this young lad. I already talked about the relationship of Devil and Popola, how they feel like mothers, and how this has worked into gameplay, but even scenes entirely isolated. You can see this very clearly. My go-to example for this has always been the scene that follows you saving Kaine's village. So let's take a listen to Gestalt.
You're going to live, Kaine.
Me? Live? What for?
What?
I had my revenge. Now it's over.
Oh, now see here. This is rich.
Vice!
We help you in some mad quest for vengeance, and now you think to bid us adieu. How can a fighter so skilled be cursed with such a thick head? A true warrior would fight. They would give all in the service of their friends.
Friends?
Yes. You and I are friends now.
See here, that was hardly the point.
Then what is the point? Kaine, come fight with us.
Fool, you can't just invite her along. There are many issues that must be carefully weighed and considered. For example, how will she possibly affect our overall ability
Cram it, book.
Now here's Replicant.
You're going to live, Kaine!
Live? What for?
What?
I had my revenge, and now it's over.
Oh, now see here, this is rich.
Vice?
We help you in some mad quest for vengeance, and now you think to bid us adieu? How can a fighter so skilled be cursed with such a thick head? A true warrior would fight. They would give all in the service of their friends.
Friends?
That's right. He's right. Kaine, we're friends now.
See here, that was hardly the point.
Okay, then what is the point? Kaine, we need your help. Will you fight with us?
Fool, you cannot simply ask her outright. There is a proper order to these matters. One must ease into the topic with carefully considered words before commencing
Cram it,
negotiations.
Again, nothing against Gestalt or the VA himself. They did well with what they had, but just looking at the script, the writing itself, it's so very clearly written for our young boy protagonist. Gestalt was an afterthought, pushed by execs, and in many ways it shows, both in the game itself and the supplementary material, always adding to the boy's lore. While it's clear to me there will always be people who prefer Gestalt, some simply just are wanting that burly man protagonist. Objectively, everything flows far better in my experience when it's viewed the way it was written and intended. Shocking, I know. The feeling of things being slightly off all those years ago finally being rectified by this release is something that brought me genuine enjoyment. to properly experience, and is a big factor in why this version has managed to elevate my love for this game. However, we've given quite the spotlight to the protagonist, so I believe it's time to shine that light elsewhere. But before we get into that directly, there's something important that needs to be addressed, and that's the localization question. Specifically because, recently, I've seen Nier brought up as a defense of heavy-handed localization changes, when another new release, The World Ends With You Neo, was coming under fire for such. And if that was the case, I think it would be important to discuss, because it would mean these characters were inaccurate to their proper Japanese portrayals. Which I'm going to tell you up front. Like most things you'll find on social media, this was simply said by someone and then repeated verbatim, without actual knowledge. Nier's script is accurate to the Japanese one. That's not to say there aren't some things lost in translation, but that's just an unfortunate side effect of the nature of translation. Anytime I see this brought up, no one seems to be able to point to any egregious examples, and the few I've seen mentioned on forums, well, let's take a look. Example 1 is framed as this. The protagonist says to the Shadow Lord,
You want me to understand your sadness?
While in Japanese, it's, I don't claim to understand your sadness. Doing that would be too presumptuous of me. I only fight for my sister, or comrades. And if anyone obstructs that, they'll be defeated. That does sound a little bad, cutting so much meaning out. However, let's actually listen to the English version.
You want me to understand your sadness? You think I'm gonna sympathize with you? I swore to protect my sister and my friends. If someone puts them in danger, they must stand aside or be cut down!
In reality, these are nearly identical, and I can only imagine the poster chose not to frame it using the whole text, because you'd see it as faithful. With both languages, the protagonist is stating he could never understand the feelings of the Shadow Lord. He's going to tear down anything that gets in the way of him being with his family. Perhaps we should look at another example then. This one takes place at Emil's sacrifice. In the English version, Kaine yells out,
Emil! You jackass, get back here! Emil!
but in the Japanese, it plays out as such.
Emil! 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 Emil!
The point made here is that the Japanese Kaine does not curse, and maybe on the surface level, that seems like a tonal disconnect. But a few things. In the Japanese version, Kaine's foul language is censored. This was done as how much to Taro's experience with Drakengard, and how harsh guidelines were at the time.
死ね死ね死ねてめえの汚ねギタギタに刻んでやる
In the same interview, Taro stated the localization team, working on Nier, saw it as too comical, ultimately leaving them to drop it. He then went on to say how happy he was hearing the English performance, with such radical words. Not too important to the point, but I found it funny. Kaine swears don't always match up between versions. They seem particularly toned down for emotional scenes. Possibly did not have the constant beeps be jarring, but there are also scenes, such as the one I played just before, where a swear is not present in English. Regardless, I think the first important takeaway is, the intent the scene strives for remains unchanged, as a desperate Kaine is pleading for her friend not to leave. Concessions just have to be made for each approach chosen, despite them both, as they should be, portraying the same trait, how foul her language is. However, one of the reasons I wanted to use this example is because I do believe there's an argument to be made that not swearing could be interpreted as her being so stunned and distraught that she drops off facade of a personality. In English, the line still maintains her heartbreak, but loses a touch of depth in that interpretation, which the translators could have not realized had they not viewed it as such to begin with. Localization is never going to be one-to-one, a topic I talked about heavily in my last video, although from the other side of the coin. I'm not saying the script is without its flaws, it's huge. there's bound to be a misstep or a disagreement on what was the best way to translate a line. I know I certainly have several. What needs to be understood, though, is there's a stark difference between a rework of sentences that strive for the original meaning, but in some cases results in a possible loss of information due to unintended consequence or lack thereof a perfect interpretation, compared to going out of your way to completely change a character's dialogue or intent to suit the localizer.
Sometimes it'll be jokes, Japanese jokes might have a little different values than we do.
Yeah. So things like, we try to kind of work around things that might be a little sexist, for example, like in Japanese humor.
Activate fire.
And with those things, we like to try to make it more culturally appropriate for our players.
And that doesn't mean it has to be made less funny either.
No, not at all. We can work in something even better sometimes.
Let's go.
If you can play this game in the original language, I suggest it. I always do. But I think the sentiment that the script made huge changes, as well as stating that it's a bad translation, is strictly pushed by those who don't know what they're talking about, or simply choose to be willfully ignorant to defend actual awful localizations, as is the case so often. Honestly, the more I looked for others' issues, the more absurd claims I would find. Like, tying into what we previously discussed, there were posters stating the protagonist's cheerful nature was heavily toned down, with no real examples given, which is obviously something I've disagreed with, dedicating an entire section to it already. In fact, as we went over, it's an aspect that many found off-putting with Gestalt, because it was clearly written for that overly optimistic, innocent boy type of character, and that came through even in that release. With that being said though, I've made my case clear, so I think it's about time we talk about our merry little gang of adventurers. The RPG party. That idea itself was what always drew me to the genre, while plenty of games that aren't RPGs could still be described as having a core party, as opposed to a sole focus on the protagonist. The fact that it feels so much more intrinsically tied to the genre is again one of the facets that drew me to it, because simply, I love characters. While some people's favorite aspects of properties are the lore, world building, narrative concepts, and such, for me, this is the kind of thing that really interests me in a story. Seeing interactions between two individuals, seeing those relationships grow and change, or just plain being entertaining. Those other pieces are still important to me, and obviously are part of creating good scenarios, but those details take a back seat for me at the end of the day. And of all the games I played, by far, my favorite party is the one in Nier. This party only truly beginning to form upon meeting Grimoire Weiss. If Devil and Popola can be viewed as mother figures, then Weiss fits the other end. This floating magical book is the closest we have to a father figure. What I like so much about the dynamic that Weiss brings to the party is when it's just the two of you, there's a complete contrast in personality. The protagonist is very much starry-eyed. As we established, he's always running errands, doing anything he can to help Yona. But to some extent, it's not only her, it's anybody honestly. If a problem is brought to him, he'll be sure to agree to help wearing a smile.
Do you often get asked to handle such inane shopping trips?
I don't think these trips are inane. Yona and I survive on the wages I earn from these jobs. Everyone has it tough around here, but they still manage to give me work. Honestly, I'm grateful for it.
I see. Well then, keep up the good work.
I will.
That's not to say that Weiss is a mean tome. He's very much always willing to go with you on every quest. Hell, he immediately started helping you on yours, despite you effectively giving him amnesia from pounding him so hard.
For the love of all that is holy, would you please stop pounding me?
However, he always has a snarky remark to make, whether it's about the protagonist's cheerful nature, the people you're running those errands for, or even humankind as a whole. He's like a stuffy old man, from his personality to his mannerisms.
What's wrong?
How can a son bring so much despair to his family? He seems completely ignorant of the pain he has caused. It's deplorable.
I love it when you sound like a grumpy old man, Weiss.
Perhaps I only sound that way because I have existed since time immemorial.
How old are you anyway?
You know, I'm not exactly sure.
They say memory loss is a sign of old age.
Well, it's still preferable to being a deplorable liar like that son.
These two contrasting perspectives of the world, one optimistic and the other cynical, allows for a lot of great dialogue, as neither of them are antagonistic toward the other. Conversations are often a back and forth. The contrast can be funny, insightful, just interesting to see these two talk. Sometimes the protagonist can learn something from Vice's more analytical worldview, and as he grows up, I think it's fair to say he was shaped by this relationship. Then on the flip side, there are times where Vice's cynicism will crack, and you see a softer side behind his hard cover.
Surely you are aware that meddling in the affairs of a married couple will accomplish nothing.
Look, I took on a job and I'm gonna see it through.
Your sense of duty is positively breathtaking.
Hey, I know what it feels like to worry about family. If we can keep others out of danger by handling stuff like this, I'm all for it.
It is a tremendous burden. And yet I cannot say I dislike that way of thinking.
Although it's not long before this party gets a third member, in Kaine.
Vice? Why's that lady in her underwear?
Personality-wise, she's perhaps closer to Vice than the protagonist, as she's certainly not positive. In fact, if there's anyone the word me would describe in this party, it's her. But there's a lot to that. Kaine early on is driven forward by one thing. That's revenge on the shade that took her grandmother away from her. And you give that to her almost immediately, leaving her life with a lack of purpose. Kaine has no one, she's a loner. All she knows how to do is fight, and with a shade possessing her body, she doesn't really have much of a chance fitting in anywhere. So that's why, when you offer her a place, some more purpose for her life, she says she'll take up her sword for you, only if temporarily. Though perhaps she ends up with far more than she bargained for. The dynamic she adds early on feels very lighthearted. She's often standoffish and stays out of conversations, only butting in to argue with Vice.
Oh no, not this task again.
We'll be fine. We just need to go slow and take it easy.
I am a creature of phenomenal talents, but those are two that escape me.
Well, I'm sure not gonna let Kaine handle it.
Indeed, the hussy's foul language would reduce our precious cargo to dust.
Yep, fucking yap. Get moving already.
At a glance, these two's arguments might seem unlike yours. They might seem far more mean-spirited. I mean, Vice is always calling her a whore, essentially, and Kaine is mouthing every curse word in the book, at the book. At the same time, though, I think you'd be reaching pretty hard to say it actually was mean-spirited. These conversations often come off as humorous. You can tell, especially as time progresses, these two care about each other. Even if it's less direct than the other dynamics of the group, it's simply what suits them best.
Hey, Vice.
Yes?
Thanks.
Have you been in your cups again?
Fuck your face.
Ah, that's more like it.
Though as stated, Kaine is a lot more than that, and those layers really begin to peel apart for the player as we meet our final addition, that is, Emile. Emile is a ball of positivity, and while this trait is something that fades some from our hero, as Emile's journey continues, and arguably becomes the most tragic of anyone, that quality never fades. He is someone far too good for the world that he was dropped into. But of course, in saying that, he's still human. He has negative feelings, especially toward himself. This is largely part of what leads him to look up to the protagonist so much, especially as that bubbly nature fades from the brother, because it's not that the protagonist becomes a cynic, it's just that the way his positivity is displayed is more mature, more reassuring, more determined. As Emile himself says, he's cool. Then there's the relationship I hinted about, Kaine and Emile. Much like her, Emile has an affliction. He was a government test subject, a weapon. Anything he looks at turns to stone, so he essentially lives blind. Both these characters exist with tragedy in their present, as well as their past, something you no doubt become accustomed to learning as the story progresses. These two's friendship leads to one of the highlights in the early game for me, taking place after first meeting Emile and learning about his situation. As the party begins to leave him, Kaine takes him to the side to talk. She tells him not to be ashamed of himself, not to be ashamed of his eyes. Then, allowing Emil to feel the shade part of her, explains that she understands his feelings, that her arm is a weapon just as well. But there's a reason she's still alive. There's a reason for her arm, and there's a reason for his eyes. This is the basis of their relationship. They're both outcasts from society, and because of this, they find companionship and understanding in each other. In fact, to some extent, they all do, but not necessarily in the same ways. Kaine and Emil's connection is vastly different from Kaine and the protagonist, or Kaine and Vice. A good scene to illustrate this is an instance when Emil brings up a private moment between the two, where Kaine was acting unstereotypically vulnerable, which is immediately followed by her shutting him up.
I can't accept that you aren't allowed in the village. It's stupid.
So you're staging a protest? Fun!
Don't waste your time.
But it just feels wrong.
Well, that's really nice of you, but you still don't have to stay out here with us.
Emil.
You got a super important mission. You can't sleep out in the rain. What if you catch a cold? Besides, I like camping with Kaine. Sometimes we sit around the fire and tell stories, or roast...
Emil, that's enough. I got a fucking image to maintain.
She doesn't want us to see this side of her, not because she doesn't trust us. She very much cares deeply for all of these individuals. It's much like a real family or group of friends. Your dynamics between each other are often different. I won't really be diving into any one character's story in particular here, because as I said, this isn't really a plot overview. While they each individually have excellent stories on their own, what really elevates them is just how much I enjoy them bouncing off one another. Seeing those interactions is almost a reward in and of itself. There's no better example of this than the side quest in Nier. Typically in games, side quests often suck. They're unimportant tasks just used as a means to give you extra experience or items. And while some games do make interesting quests or lore that come with them, the reason I 100% Nier when I play it isn't for any of that specifically. I just like seeing these characters respond to events, whether it is an interesting narrative or simply their comments on running those errands.
That man simply hops from one woman to the next, does he not?
He's been cheating this whole time? That's just terrible.
Doubtless he will end up suffering at the hands of one of his paramours sooner or later.
I don't think he means any harm. This kind of thing just happens with attractive guys.
That's awful! What if a man did that to you, Kaine?
He'd wake up a little less man than he used to be.
Change my mind. Cheating is always wrong.
A lot of these missions, you waste so much time and often more money than you get back, but it was never a thing I complained about, because much like real relationships, the reward of it wasn't something tangible, it was spending time with these people. And that carries into those giving said quest a lot of the time. These little stories can have more emotional impact than a lot of AAA games that pride themselves on their narrative, whether it's the lighthouse lady, the man and his dog, or the child who befriended a shade, even the tiniest of moments. There's this one quest line added into this release that involves that couple with a pair of matching red bags. They insist you come to dinner at their house, so you accept and sit down at the table, eat a home-cooked meal, surrounded by this little family that you've been welcomed into. Then in the middle of the dinner, the protagonist, looking at the people surrounding him, the food on his plate, he says he's happy because it's the first time, in a very long time, that he felt normal.
Illuminated by candlelight, the married couple fills the room with joyous laughter. The scene fills me with an unfamiliar sense of calm. Just a happy family gathered around the table. It feels so very normal. I never thought I'd feel this way again. So I stuff my face with the great feast before me, hoping it helps to hide the tears welling in my eyes.
I don't know, that just warmed my heart and hurt it so painfully all the same. If there's one thing I can hope this re-release does, is that these characters get more of the recognition they deserve. It's a shame that whether it be fan art or conversation, I very rarely see them brought up with one exception. Like, I've always been slightly confused and maybe even a little peeved that the main time I do actually hear anything, it's for very superficial reasons. Don't get me wrong, I think those things are interesting, and I've covered them in one of my first videos, but I always hated that it seemed to be the #1 fun fact for the game, since it robs people out of a very striking reveal when you align those pieces up, as well as boiling down amazing characters to only one detail, despite not even caring to understand the significance of it, a sentiment seemingly not only held by me. Yoko Taro himself even mentioning in interviews his surprise that Kaine's biology in particular was marketed to people, as he expected it to be a big surprise for players. However, I digress, because I think it's time we talk about the one trait that Taro's works are really known for. While characters are always my favorite aspect of his work, the most talked about facet of Taro's catalog is how depressing his narratives themselves are. That fixation is not without merit. For me, one of the more interesting pieces of the story itself is the dual morality of it. Nowadays, you constantly have these narratives being circle-jerked by creators, the journalist media, and consumers alike, where the main message is, oh, that guy or thing you thought was good is actually bad. Even in cases where that's clearly not the purpose, you see these pretentious types so buried up their own asshole, they're bending backwards to turn any story into the trope. Which is how you end up with articles trying to claim stuff like, the hunters in Monster Hunter are the real monsters. Keep in mind this is my favorite example to use, because it shows how lacking these types are at even absorbing the media. It's explained in the Monster Hunter series that the hunters are fixing overpopulation. You are aiding the ecosystem. So, suffice to say, these takes are not smart, often wrong, and even when they're not, are overplayed without any originality. On the other hand, let's take a look at how Nier makes us experience its story. Your first playthrough is completely through your own perspective. Realistically, throughout its runtime, you should have no serious doubts about the path you're on. This is until you get to the Shadow Lord's castle, and have to come face to face with the two women who were for the longest time like mothers to you. While touched on before, I really love the emotions here. The sorrow you feel in Devla's voice immediately when she asks you to just turn around.
Popola, Devla, what are you doing here?
Hey, any chance you'll just go back to the village?
The anger, the sadness, all the emotions that make up a trail within every line the protagonist delivers.
The Shadow Lord? So you've been on his side this whole time?
Eventually, he's left with no choice but to cut them both down. Neither of these groups wants to fight each other, that much is clear, but as Popola says, there's no stopping now.
Stop? Now you want to stop? You think you have the luxury to stop?
A sentiment that is continually felt as you make your way up this castle. Soon you lose one of your best friends, and another, but you can hardly turn back now. You can only keep moving forward, or it's all in vain. And as you walk forward, as you take those final steps, the pieces start to fall together. You learn of Project Gestalt and the replicas, that this Shadow Lord was the original you, the original soul that was housed in your body. All the other shades being the same, the original humans of this world, while the humans we've come to know are mere replicas, the shell for that soul, the body that gained its own sentience. You, all of your friends, every person you've met along this journey were never meant to exist. It becomes clear the Shadow Lord's goals were never all that different. His plans were brought on by love, his devotion for his Yona, all the same as yours. You were both going to save humanity, but who that was to each of you was entirely different. The player's head at this point is possibly full of all these questions. Are you in the wrong here? Which side has a right to these bodies? But the game never forces you to ponder these questions. You could be like me. You could not be conflicted. You came this far. Nothing will stop you from saving your sister. However, This exact thought process is perfectly represented in that moment, where you're about to deliver the final blow, and for a second, the protagonist hesitates. You can see it on his face, as those thoughts seemingly crawl into his head as they could of yours, then shaking his head, as if realizing it's too late to even consider. The Shadow Lord had his ambitions, and you had yours. Unfortunately, it really just is that simple. There was never a way for them to coexist. When it's said and done, you're given your happy ending. Very happy in my case, as you might recall. But point being, you got what you came here for. You were not meant to feel bad about these actions, and that's important for now. As with Route B, you will be presented the same events a second time, but now the perspective is flipped, as well as given additional context. Although a keen eye, even back in Route A, will definitely pick up on things here and there, or side quests might start cueing you into some oddities with the creatures we've been fighting against. The instance that sticks out to me is how early on, the smaller shades don't attack you at all. They'll just stare at you and almost seem friendly. I guess you could view that as a precursor to all the other revelations we're about to discuss when experiencing Route B. A lot of these scenes were tragic the first time, and now you might feel horrible for completely different reasons. In fact, I think it's a really smart decision, because it can be extremely tedious viewing the same campaign immediately, and this is something a sequel fails at heavily. But with Replicant, I think this new content in combination with the sped up nature of the playthrough is enough to draw you in all over again. For example, on Route A, those sacrifices are some of the hardest scenes for me to get through. One in particular really highlights a character I hadn't had a chance to talk about until now. That's the King of Facade. Nearing the top of the Shadow Lord's castle, the party is struggling against a shade that seemingly won't die. As things start to feel hopeless, the king and his men make their appearance. While your friendship began with you showing up uninvited to save him, here he is not only repaying that favor to you by doing the same, but laying down everything to avenge the woman he loves from the creatures that took her away from him. And despite their success, that's exactly what happens. He lays down his life, reminiscing of what they had and how they'll be together again. What really brings this home for me, though, is how it's handled by the party, or lack thereof. There's no time to dwell on it. The protagonist, while clearly deeply affected by the actions of the king, can only weakly let out the words, "My friend," before he has to press on. Theoretically, it might seem like all impact would be lost, having to view that again only hours later, but now through Route B, we're presented with the other side of the story. That these shades were finally able to reproduce, find some companionship, and you're here slaughtering the fruit of that, the couples themselves, as well as the children. The giant shade that specifically would not die is an aggregation of the parents fusing with the children left, this new being driven forward too by both the will to protect what they love and avenge what was taken from them. The fact that this exact scene can get me to a similar emotional point as the first time when I was viewing it in such close proximity speaks to the quality of how this was handled. Each side views the other as a destructive monster, taking what the other values most away. And it's not that either of them are wrong for thinking that, it's the reality of the situation. The point of this story isn't that you're the villain. At its core, this story is a tragedy, and one of the most classic ones at that. Everything is brought on by miscommunication. No one can talk, and the few people that can, well, it's far past the point of being an option. These are such sad human circumstances, and it's not only the core of the overarching story, but you can see these themes, these little human tragedies, throughout the quest you've been embarking on, leading us to the biggest tragedy of them all. while we did get our happy ending, I'm sure every player felt at least a little off when Kaine chose to walk away in that original run. Nothing major, mind you. The first time I thought she was just being her usual self, not wanting to be around for those soft, emotional moments. This is technically not wrong, but what we came to find out through subsequent rounds is Kaine, if those walls were to break, if she starts feeling those emotions, the shade in her will take her over completely. That's why she walks away. And keep in mind, Route B is called Kaine's route. She was the one enduring the duality of these situations just as much as the player is now. She just isn't allowed to feel a goddamn thing. But you're the one who messed that all up. It's not like she resents you for that. In fact, she seems happy. She said it herself, she'll gladly stick by you to the end. She'll gladly be your sword. And now with your third playthrough, she'll even ask you to end her own life. As unable to hold back her feelings, Kaine relapses, becoming the monster she feared. Just one last person to put down their life for you, like so many did before her. However, this time, you the player are given one final choice, one final trigger to pull. Tyran, the shade that existed inside Kaine, having softened up to both her and seemingly you, offers another solution. But with a catch, you can save Kaine at the cost of your own existence. And because this is a video game, it allows this choice to be handled more literally than any other medium would allow. If you say yes to this, if you would give up your own existence to save Kaine, then your save file will be taken in exchange. A climax of everything we've discussed so far, this is not simply a choice a player makes for a character in a video game to give something up. This is a choice between you and Kaine, where something real will be lost. For those that accept this, everything vanishes before your eyes. Every quest you've completed, every item you've picked up, whether it was a storage-rich sword, or one of the million buckets you fished out trying to catch a resident. All those memories are gone from this world, as if they never happened. But with that sacrifice, Kaine finally gets to live in that world. Now once again, because this is a video game, an immediate thought throughout that whole process, despite how the game ensures you this is permanent, might have been, oh, well, I can just make a backup save. Or even more likely, maybe you simply want to return to this game at another time, experience the whole adventure again. But you signed away that choice to save her. Your story, does not exist in this world anymore. As far as anyone's concerned, it never did. That's why you won't be able to use a save file with that name again. The game will outright refuse to accept it, no matter what you do. This to me, the events of Ending D and the very real consequence of my choice, are one of the first things I think of when it comes to Nier. It left an impression on me other media just hasn't come close to. But it's also something that can only be done in games. You won't be able to have this consequence by watching a movie or reading a book. It wasn't simply just something written or told to me that I give up my existence. To some extent, it's really gone. So many individuals in this landscape, whether it be journalists, consumers, or developers themselves, just want gaming to essentially be playable movies. And that to me is missing the true potential of what this medium can deliver. Perhaps you've heard me talk about this a lot throughout my time on YouTube, but this is one of the experiences that make me so firm in my stances. While it's fine for those products to exist, and they have merit, sure, I strongly disagree with those that will hold them up as the pinnacle, as I believe the absolute best experiences are the stories not simply chosen to be presented as video games, but ones that become more for being so. That was where things ended about a decade ago, but with this release we have one final scenario. For those who don't know, this Ending E was always the canon ending, Unfortunately though, it was locked to a Japanese exclusive book release titled Grimoire Nier. It featured illustrations, concept designs, and more short stories that took place in this universe. You'll recall throughout this video I made reference to a couple with a pair of matching red bags. While added into this release, the storyline they tie into was originally the Grimoire Nier short story Little Mermaid. Up to this point I've neglected to mention directly how naturally its addition felt integrated into the game. So much so that I actually was confused at first. Whenever pieces of this questline were interwoven into the main narrative, like, oh, did I forget about this? And as time went on, this questline became one of the highlights of the game. I genuinely believe Louise's story, The Little Mermaid, is the best of all the shades. It's certainly the one that chokes me up the most now. In comparison, a lot of other games completely fail at this integration when it comes to adding content to remakes. I think the smoothness is largely in part to these additions not being added as a bonus because, oh, we're remaking the game, gotta add more content so people buy it again. But this story and Ending E were ideas Taro had that did not make it into the original release, for one reason or another. This time has also given ample opportunity for these ideas to grow as they sat in Taro's head, another facet of why I think they're now some of the best parts of the game. So that leaves us with one final topic to discuss then. That's Ending E itself. Much like my original thoughts toward the pop-up protagonist, knowing the final stretch of the story was often some art book just piled on more feelings that this experience was incomplete, despite my affection for it. Not to mention, the original version of events presented in Grimoire Nier felt lacking on its own. To put it simply, it has its positives like using Kaine's thigh as a form of measurement, but I did just explain how this story benefits from being a game, didn't I? Taking away all that to give a more traditional ending left me feeling like Ending D was the better conclusion. That said, if you ask me now, I'd say the adaptation and finalization of those original ideas into video game form has left us with something far greater. This new version takes advantage of the medium just as D did. It preys on exactly that scenario I talked about, where the player might want to come back later in life to play it again. So let's get into that. While the original you is gone and that journey can't be repeated, you can start again with a new name and a seemingly new existence. It is just a video game in the end. They're not locking you out of playing it completely. Events will happen just as before, and they do transpire, about as you recall them.
Miracles don't happen if you don't believe in them, okay?
But that's until you get to the Aerie. Having saved the town, you call out to an unconscious Kaine, begging her to live, and in her mind she goes to reach for your character's metaphorical hand, as she did so long ago, but then it vanishes. She falls into darkness. Suddenly waking up 3 years past, the point where we left her in Ending D. That playthrough you had just started was only vague memories. She couldn't even get your name right. From here, as a treat, you get to play as her, uncover some secrets, see where the world is now, and it fits thematically so well with how things originally ended. You gave your life to her, it's her world to finally live in. But as soon as those curiosities of the state of the world start, you're forced back into the thick of it. There's automations attacking people at the Forest of Myth. Once arriving, you're too late, but as Kaine does, she cuts down every single automation in her path, and following the source of those machines, Kaine finds herself heading into the Divine Tree. In here, she begins hearing robotic voices, expositing to her what we the player have already put together. The Divine Tree is a supercomputer, used in the process of making replicants. The tree holding all the data, or memories, that take place in the world, that the actions of our merry little gang have ultimately doomed humanity. Of course, my summary here is perhaps more than Kaine herself absorbs.
If you wanted me to follow any of this, you're gonna be real fucking disappointed.
Reaching deeper, those automations begin to take a form to mirror Kaine's appearance, and using her own combat data, begin overwhelming her, until Emile ultimately makes a save. The two reunited have some nice moments reminiscing, and as they finish off these machines, moving deeper into the tree, you find out it's not only Kaine with faint memories, but Emile as well. He remembers making someone important a promise.
Just think of all the delicious local foods we can try along the way.
I'm gonna eat way more than my fair share, so you better get ready to pony up.
And that, of course, is not all. Even in a world without you, you're still the thing she loves most, you know. While Yona doesn't make an appearance in this new ending, something you might miss is one of the new load screens paints a very clear picture of our little sister in this world. It's written into the diary on June 6th, the protagonist's birthday, your birthday. She wakes up that morning crying. She doesn't understand why, but all she knows is that she's sad. Your friends, your family, are not going to sit by and let this world forget about you. That desire to see you again is what drags them to the heart of the divine tree. But as Kaine forces her way in, she finds herself alone again. We're told this is the data center, and that those old forgotten memories are here, but to reach them, she will have to confront every memory she's lost, including the one she's locked away. As Kaine fights, both of you, as in the literal player as well, are confronted with all of your actions up to this point from the game prior. Nier still never wags its finger in front of you and says you're in the wrong for what you did, but it will for once confront you directly and ask if you were justified. If you stick by your actions that resulted in dooming humanity. Kaine has her answer.
I kill shades! That's all there is to it!
I can't tell you yours, but I know mine. While you have that to wrestle with, the more literal conflict continues to escalate. Kaine now facing a data clone of Hook, the memories of the town that treated her so poorly, a world where her grandmother is alive, just to rip the woman away from her once again. Of course it's too much for her. It would be for anyone. But just as he was last to leave your side,
I say, can you hear me?
Grimoire Vice comes to Kaine's, giving her the power he once gave to you. The two have their own touching exchanges that you might recall from a half hour ago, but with their wills combined, they are able to overcome this nightmare. And as they deliver that last blow, a montage of the events, the memories of the world prior, is unloaded onto the player, having a very important monologue from Kaine coming with it.
Don't go. Gotta go back. Don't go.
Shut up! I already made up my mind. Nobody tells me what to do. I swore I would be a sword. I swore that I would be your sword. Do you hear me? So I am going to get you back, and I don't care what it takes. Who the fuck do you think you are to just up and disappear like that, huh? I'm the one who gets to decide what my life means to me. It's my life, and I'll do whatever I want with it. So quit wasting time like a brainless fuckwit and get your ass back here now!
This right here is what solidifies my view of the ending, and is also why I've chosen to speak in more detail of the events that lead up to it, as ending E is effectively completely undoing everything that took place in D, which just saying that on its own can sound cheap. So many remakes or revivals do that, something that undoes the weight that came before for the sake of continuation. Having just a short summary saying all your friends came back to save you definitely invokes those feelings. I have seen some still view it that way, but I think what really distinguishes it is while E is a betrayal of that final wish, it isn't a betrayal of the story, something very purposeful. It doesn't matter if you were content giving up everything for Kaine. If you thought that story wrapped up perfectly, Kaine isn't the kind of person to accept that. You hurt her. She is going to bring you back. Anyone else's feelings, even yours, this entire world, be damned. So in the same manner that you gave your life to her, Kaine approaches your body and returns that life. The pages come back, and you see every quest you've completed, every item you've picked up, whether it was a storied-rich sword, or one of the million buckets you fished out, trying to catch a resident. Vice loses the last of the power he mustered to help bring us back, leaving him to fade away again. But being the Chad he was until the very end, his last breaths are not wasted, calling Kaine a hussy one last time.
I leave the rest to you, hussy.
thus leaving us on one final scene, Kaine, holding our newly reborn body in her arms, as both her and Emil state what should be obvious.
Our journey may have been meaningless.
Our past may have been a mistake.
But we're not going back.
Even if this world comes to an end.
Because this is the world with the people we cherish.
I love this additional round. I think those final words really summarize what's so strong about it. He acknowledges the full consequence of what you've done, and while your own conclusions are once again yours, the sentiments expressed by the rest of the party are something I align with. It's so incredibly easy to say you're the bad guy here. So many pretentious, boring people try to act like this is some big brain almond activating analysis, but it's really not. It's the simplest, laziest conclusion to come to, ignoring all complexity. If Nier has anything to say about being the bad guy, its commentary is much more universal. It's something echoed not just through the party, but every conflict, every side, presented in the game. You don't have to be a bad person to do bad things. You just have to believe yourself justified. So, sure, you can view the cast as bad guys, but I certainly do not. I don't even think it matters to me, because there wasn't a moment at any point during my playthrough where I questioned my choices. And it wasn't out of ignorance. It wasn't out of lack of sympathy. It was because I also wouldn't accept a world without my friends. Half a decade ago, that led me to giving up my save file. And on June 7th, 2021, I felt like I finally got it back. I can't properly convey the catharsis I felt, as if there was 5 years of buildup to that moment, where everything felt complete. Perhaps there's an argument that E lacks the finality of D, that E isn't as striking because of this, but Nier was always about the meta in its ending, that real sacrifice, actually giving something up for someone else. Maybe being able to explore that version of the world, post 3 years. Having the file locked there could possibly achieve both the finality of D, while not losing the catharsis. Even that I'm shaky on though, because Kaine giving you back exactly what you lost. That freedom of choice with that save is crucial, and conceivably makes the meta in this exchange even stronger. Kaine was given the ability to choose what to do with her life. What you do with your existence, that save file, is all on you. Me having to sit on the loss for 5 years is certainly something that elevates this, and I don't think removing that bias is possible. However, even without that factor, what makes E so incredible to me is it reminded me so much of what it was like to be a kid again. When I was young, I used to think games were magical. I always felt there was something new to discover, that every game had a near infinite supply of secrets hidden away. It's the kind of stories you hear from people's childhoods, on the internet all the time. Whether it was believing L is real 2041 in Super Mario 64, being able to unlock Sonic in Super Smash Bros. Melee, or Mew being hidden under a truck in the original Pokemon. Actually, that specifically is what this ending brings me back to. Not necessarily in that truck rumor, but how we got there. Satoshi Tajiri originally envisioned Mew due to experiences playing Xevious as a teenager. There were schoolyard rumors that you had a 1 in a million chance to see an F4 Phantom fighter jet. This rumor existing due to some code being left over from an early prototype. Wondering what myths could come of Pokemon, Mew was ultimately added into the code, as Tajiri described it, a character that exists but does not appear. It's thanks to these one-off examples, where something crazy actually exists, whether it was intentional or not. Or a game asking an absurd requirement, like leaving Super Smash Bros. Melee on for 20 hours to unlock Mewtwo. These instances make all those other rumors so believable, even if only Nick's cousin, who you've never met, was able to achieve them. Video games felt like they could go on forever, but I'm older now. I understand their limits, their development, and I've played so many games that not many things surprise me anymore. However, the way E plays out, the way it utilizes this medium, it takes me back to that. It sounds like one of those crazy stories. Perhaps the craziest. It's something I've never experienced before. Sure, you can say the internet will spoil it for most people. This video might even be doing it now. But not everyone is like that. I just pick up games that pique my interest, without looking up reviews or press releases. And going back to when I was younger, this was even more the case. Not really talking to people about games, whether it was in person or on the internet, even when those options were available. So even if it's not me or you, I think if just a couple people have that experience, if it makes just a few have that moment where they pick up Nier again a few months later, or maybe they're achievement hunting right after the fact, whatever leads them to the shock of the protagonist's hand disappearing and getting back the thing they lost. If just a few people's minds can be blown, if just a few more of those crazy video game stories exist on the internet, if for a moment video games are magical again, then I think Nier Replicant is something special.
Are you crying?
Yeah. I guess I am. It's like I just found something special. Something very special.